So let's start with this big question. How, in the big picture, Africa's got to make stuff. It's got to sell stuff to the world. What is your sense right now of that view from 30,000 feet of how Africa's doing?
Well, look, first of all, thank you very much. I'm not so sure Africa's got to sell stuff to the rest of the world for a beginning. I think if you take the population in Africa and the potential in Africa, we're not even, it's almost like what people have been trying to achieve in creating a euro, what you have in the United States of America exists in Africa. There's a huge population, and what Africa needs to do in the beginning is to produce enough stuff that you can kind of bring in this trade deficit you're talking about. So I'm not one of those who's going for the sky. I think first let Africa produce for Africans, and then we'll worry about the rest of the world later.
So we're seeing some pretty good examples of that, admittedly in countries that are going through a very tough time. And let's look at Nigeria right now, which oil prices down, real kind of struggle with forex, and Nigeria's president has really said we need to do stuff for ourselves now. And how's that going?
Well, another thing is you're talking about import substitution, basically, and import substitution is not a silver bullet. It's going to take a while. It's going to take 3 to 5 years. You can't go from a country that imports to a country that's self-sufficient overnight. If it's in agriculture, you have to plant, you have to water, you have to build big foundations. If it's in power, you need to develop your own local substitute. So I think we started the journey. I think oil prices coming down from 115 to 50 is actually a blessing for the country. It's forced us to look inwards. And I think Nigerians are very ingenious and very creative people. And I'm confident in about 3 to 5 years, you will start to see that import substitution. But it's not going to happen in 365 days, no.
And let's take this sort of more broadly. So Nigeria has been forced into this position. As you say, low oil prices is actually a blessing, forcing the country to make some tough decisions. But if you look a bit more broadly, what is the trend that you see there?
Obviously, I'm very partial. I mean, that's why I like the whole Made in Africa thing. I think that, for me, Nigeria, there's no country, I'm sorry, that's like Nigeria. I do business across continents. To replicate what you have in Nigeria, you have to put together 4 or 5 countries in Africa. So where you have a population of about 170 to 180 million people, very talented, very young, very exposed, every day you wake up with a lot of optimism and not what you read in the papers. I happen to run a company or a bank that is 90% revenue in Nigeria. Has ROEs north of 28%, income of over $500 million. So I can never see anything but optimism. And so when I think of Nigeria over the next few years and I look at the young people here and the young people I wake up every day with, I just wake up with a lot of energy and a lot of optimism and not a lot of the negatives that people tend to see.
So again, as I say, I share your optimism and your hopefulness, but there are some real issues in Nigeria that are blocking the establishment of business. The power doesn't work. The power, you want to build a factory, you've got to build a power plant with it. You want to, once you've got your power plant, you've got to build a water plant. Once you've got your water plant, you've got to build the road. All of that kind of stuff. And I just wonder, again, what is your sense about how the government is addressing all of those frictions and barriers?
Well, first of all, I mean, you're talking about infrastructure, which really, in most parts of the world, people would say government should provide. But again, I don't think, if you look at what has happened, the days when government could provide all the infrastructure are gone. I mean, the days when governments had huge surpluses and you could do that are gone. I think you have to start to think of, working with the private sector to put infrastructure in place. You have to work with developmental agencies to help assist putting your infrastructure in place. But, part of the reason why you have ROEs of 30, 40% is because you have to provide your power and you have to provide your water, and that's some of the trade-off. I mean, some of the hardship of doing business, you're rewarded in the profit. And then while those problems exist, I truly believe that as you have a new generation of Africans go into politics, leave the private sector, that those things will fix themselves over time. And that, yes, I think there's a panel which I'm looking forward to listening to on power. And I was joking with the gentleman in charge of GE in Africa that, our power structure and our power policy was wrong from the get-go, and so the fact that it's not working shouldn't have come as a surprise to anybody. So we will have to fix those things. We'll have to go back, fix them before we go forward.
Yeah, and let's again stick with, I guess, with the role that the government needs to play, because, and I'm sure you've had the same conversation, you can travel around on the continent, you meet, Minister of Finance or Minister of Industry, and at some point they will take out this, thick document that says, look at our industrial policy plan. And I say, that's, again, that's great, but before you start talking about kind of tariff barriers and industrial policies and preferential rates and all of these kinds of things, does your port work? Can people get stuff out? And so coming back to Nigeria, what is, again, what view do you take on the fact that you have had a state that over years has been very interventionist? It's created a domestic cement industry. It's creating other industries. How's that been working out?
Well, like most Nigerians, I'm sure those in this room, we spend so much time government bashing that more of us need to introspect and actually ask ourselves how many of us have even built great businesses. And then maybe if we all built very successful businesses instead of government bashing, we would have created enough of a nucleus and enough power where we could influence government. And I don't think we have enough big private sector institutions, and that is why government has been able to work the way it does. Even in developed economies, there's always a very strong private sector lobby, but a private sector lobby comes from creating very successful private sector institutions. So the failure is not just the failure of government. I think there has also been a bit of a failure in the private sector that just hasn't been as big or as successful as it should be.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And I guess now's an interesting time. I'm going to come to the floor for some questions in a few moments, so start gathering them. But I'm also just going to ask for a quick moment of audience participation, which is the guys at McKinsey did some studies on how many big firms Africa has produced. And they guarantee me that it's and the audience here will always be surprised, but I think they may have had first mover advantage because they've probably been asking this question to people like you for quite some time. But if one thinks of how many companies Africa has, domestic companies that have a turnover of more than $1 billion, let's just ask for a show of hands on the range. Do people think it's 200 to 300, 400 to 500, or sort of 500 to 700? How many companies out there? So hands up, sort of 2 to 300. Okay, a few hands. 300 to 400. How many hands have we got? 400 to 500. Sorry, did I just ask that? And how many sort of think way north of 500? Or, okay, a few hands around. So the McKinsey numbers I thought were really interesting because the number that they came up with was 400 big firms with turnover of $1 billion a year. Which frankly I found quite surprising because if I had to try to name them, I probably couldn't name more than 20. If you then go one step down and say firms with turnover of $500 million to $1 billion, that number goes up to 700. So on the one hand, it's surprising. These are numbers that are bigger than we can automatically think of. But actually, if you consider the size of Africa and the population, those are tiny numbers. I mean, 400 big firms is not a lot. And I guess my question to you is, what is holding back the development of big firms? Let's start with that.
Sure. Okay, obviously you've hit on one. It is a challenging environment. It's a very unique environment. You have infrastructural problems. I also think, though, that we have cultural issues. Most people start out building businesses and don't think of building institutions. They build businesses for them, their children, maybe their grandchildren, even if they think very far ahead. And most people are not bold enough or audacious enough to think of creating something that's bigger than them, that will outlive them. So you have cultural issues. Of course, you have the infrastructure issues. And I just think also maybe I really am not sure it's infrastructure. I think if you pushed me into a corner, I would say there's people that are just not even thinking big enough about creating large institutions.
Yeah.
And that once you and your family and your grandchildren are comfortable, you've built a business for them, you know, that has been the definition of success.
Let's take a step back, which is, where is that pipeline of companies coming from? So before we even talk about the kind of medium-sized to big-ish family-owned businesses that we really need to grow, what is your sense of what's happening in the kind of world of small and medium-sized enterprises?
Well, first, if I understand the question correctly, I think if you're looking for the big firms, you'll probably find most of them are financial services, you'll have some telcos, and you'll probably have fast-moving consumables, and that those are the big companies. When you look at the small companies, God, if we're beginning to get into the SME space, then, you know, that's all over the place. It's a very wide map, and when you talk about SMEs in Africa, which I'm beginning to learn, which is a new area for me, you've got to really pick where you want to go, because there are huge clusters in every sector. One of those that I have started to find very interesting is food. Where you have a large population, people will eat. And so people who are serving that sector are beginning to grow. And I think you will find that a lot of those SMEs will grow into big companies. Another sector I like is fashion. I mean, I think people must clothe, not necessarily high. You're not talking about high value items. You're probably talking $5 to $10 items. And so for me, I mean, any sector in the SME that you look at is probably a real growth area, and you have to pick where you want to play.
Now, yeah, this is not about banker bashing, but as the banker in the room, or in the hot spot, I'm going to put you on the spot slightly, which is that, you know, when I talk to companies in both East and West Africa, I mean, it really feels to me that the banking intermediation is broken. If you want to get a loan to grow a business in, you know, Accra or Lagos or Nairobi, you know, you're talking about interest rates that are, well, firstly now in Nairobi you can't even get a loan because the government's fixed interest rates at, you know, at a level that nobody's going to lend at. But if you talk about the surrounding countries, you know, 20%, 30% rates of interest, how does one grow a business at that?
Okay, well, let me first about the banker bashing. If I was in this room, I tend to tell people I'm a doctor when I get into black cabs. You know, it's kind of what people think is worth doing. But, you know, banker bashing is universal. It's not just an African thing. I think what you see happening across Africa in terms of disintermediation is actually rational behavior at work. First of all, banks only have two sources of funds to lend: depositors' funds, shareholders' funds. None of it is yours to give away. So when you give out loans, you basically want them to be paid back. So you look at the asset landscape you have. You have risk-free rate, you have fixed income securities that are going to pay you 22%. There are no MPLs coming down the road. So the rational thing to do is to put a lot of your deposit based in fixed income securities. So there is a certain amount of crowding out that is causing the disintermediation. The rest of your money you put where the risk is good, which tends to be the high end. So you're just seeing rational behavior at play. I don't really see it as kind of banker bashing. I think that any bank that's doing the opposite, actually as a shareholder, you should ask the CEO, you should fire the CEO. Because, you know, he's putting your money at risk. So for as long as those fixed income yields are high, and for as long as there's a lot of risk down, and you can make your money by lending to the high end, your risk rating 1s and 2s, and going to fixed income, then that disintermediation will continue. So that's an infrastructural problem that has to be fixed. And it's not a banker problem.
And what happens when you sit down with the governor of the central bank or the minister of finance, you know, in any of your countries, and you say to them, look, guys, you know, we would love to be lending to these SMEs and businesses that are going to grow and make stuff in Africa, but, you know, right now you're borrowing and we're going to keep holding T-bills as long as that keeps happening.
Well, they probably won't believe us anyway if we said that, but I think they would still say, in spite of the high T-bills, we should still lend to the SMEs and we should still lend to the high-risk sectors. But what they've got to remember is that these are private institutions. you got to preserve shareholder value. And for as long as that's what you are, and you're not developmental agencies or government banks, it's really not going to work. And that you have to find a way where you fix the macro, where interest rates are at a decent level, where you don't have a lot of crowding out, and there is an incentive to come down in the value chain and do the lending.
Well said. Are there any questions out here? And if you wave your hands, and do we have roving mics, or are you just going to stand up and? Okay, so there's a mic over there. Let's take 3 questions. So one down this aisle.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Would you stand up and introduce yourself, if you wouldn't mind?
Hi, my name is Faisal Rafi. I work for an investment consultant that works with African pension funds. We've got quite a bit of exposure to Nigeria. My question is, would you share your thoughts on how does Nigeria get out of this FX mess? Do you think that the exchange rate will float eventually, or we're just going to continue it like this until the environment improves?
Should we take 2 or 3 questions and then you can come back to them?
Okay.
Or do you want to take them one at a time?
Maybe I'll take them one at a time, just much quicker to remember. I think to get out of the FX mess, you have to eventually float the exchange rate. It's not possible to operate with multiple exchange rates, because then, as investors, people are not sure which one to come in at and which one to exit at. However, in the defense of, I don't work for government, but you'll see that what has started to happen is you're trying to control the parallel market rate. And I believe that in doing that, it's the first step towards releasing what is the official exchange rate. But you definitely cannot solve the FX situation without having a floating, transparent exchange rate.
Great. Question, there was one to the front here, could we have the mic in the front here, please? Okay, sorry, number 2 over there, and then...
Okay, hi. My name is Yossi, and I work at the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. I'll state my question first and then give you context. So, what is your honest assessment of the extent to which the government creates an enabling environment for, one, businesses to thrive and private sector investment? So you talked about government bashing and the failure of the private sector, but what we do a lot of advocacy work where there are investors, fund managers, LPs, they want to put money there, and then we have to sort of get regulators and people and policymakers to ensure that that process is easy. So it's not government bashing, but what is the government doing to ensure that capital flow is as easy as possible?
Okay, sorry if I understood the question properly. Is the what's government doing to create an enabling environment? Government obviously has a role, and I think that is the major role government has. I think we put a lot of pressure on government asking for infrastructure and all those other things, and that if you did manage to create an enabling environment, all those things will follow. My realistic assumption and assessment of most governments in Africa is that they haven't done that very well. And part of it, again, I always like to look inwards and say part of it, again, is that not enough people who are graduating from London Business School have gone to government. And then maybe you'll begin to get the results of exactly what you're putting in. And then more bright people need to get involved and work for government in Africa. And maybe that really is the solution and the way forward.
Great. A question to the front here, please.
My name is Edodu, associated with Afrexit Bank. I wanted to ask my friend Segun about what he talked about, the failure of the private sector to grow. As much as would have enabled it to drive government in desirable directions. A young lady did a study of Africa recently and found that African billionaires became billionaires by harnessing rent, not by doing anything unique. And since we are in a business school, talking to business school, in business school environment, what strikes me about what this lady was talking about in her study is that many billionaires in the West arise from doing something, innovation, innovation. Whether you are thinking of WhatsApp, you're thinking of Mr. Bill Gates, or you're thinking of, the billionaires arose from something you could significantly see, that is innovation. The billionaires in Africa, in Nigeria and elsewhere, arose from rent-seeking.
Thanks, Chris.
How can the young business graduates here begin to be the parties that bring innovation and create the new private sector, that we have new billionaires that will drive the African economies? Secondly, Segun talks about disintermediation and bank bashing. Do you see that as, again, part of government failure? Because a bank that puts money in fixed income, puts money in foreign exchange, avoids giving loans, and still makes super profits, and the government doesn't tax it. If I were a government, I would sweep all that back. I will sweep all that back. Every time incomes are made from buying fixed income securities, buying treasury bills, and the bank is afloat with huge profits, those profits are going to come back to government. Through what? Through tax. So that the banks will then see a need to lend, see a need to create the new generation innovators from the London Business School, who will be our new billionaires like the Western billionaires.
The first thing is, my advice to most people leaving business school is that your motivation shouldn't be to be billionaires. When I think of success in life, I don't think of money. I think of success in life as creating things that are special and creating value. So in talking to you, I'm not even looking at billions or looking at billionaires. I'm looking at you building institutions that will make a difference. It's not about the money. If you create enough institutions that make a difference, you'll be able to influence government. You don't need to be rent seekers. You don't need to start out wanting to be billionaires anyway. I know a lot of billionaires, and I think it's overrated. You know, they eat and sleep like I do. They probably have more problems, so I wouldn't really want that to be my motivation. In terms of the rent-seeking, again, like I said, it's logical, rational behavior. If government wants, which it does, it can tax the T-bills, but for as long as government continues to borrow at an exorbitant rate, most of you are so smart here. The benchmark risk-free interest rate is the fixed income rate. Once it at a very high rate, the logical, rational thing to do is that is the lowest interest rate in an economy. And any rational banker is going to put his money there. Everybody else borrows above that. You can tax it as much as you want. You will never change that behavior if interest rates remain high on fixed income.
Great. I saw some hands over there. So,
my name is Alim Abubakri. I'm the CEO of TechSem, and we train CEOs, directors, chairs of boards, and government ministers from Africa. And I'm also on the advisory board of London Business School Africa Summit. My question is in two folds. The first is, how do you manage your very big bottom of the pyramid customers? I was speaking with one of my clients who's the director of one of your competitors, and he said one of the biggest mistakes they made was they increased the balance in their bank to a certain figure, and most of them went to GT Bank, and now GT Bank has more, bottom of the pyramid customers. And second is connected to my business. How do you reach out to luxury clients, or how do you provide luxury services to clients in the markets that you operate in? Thank you.
Well, I think I know those competitors, and I've always said to them, it's going to take them 5 years to try to catch up now, because while they were all being snooty, we had zero balance, And so now we have over 10 million customers. And that's why I said the wealth in Africa is now the people, less the natural resources. Everybody focuses on the natural resources, but the real wealth in Africa is the growing, enlightened, exposed population. And that's what has happened. In terms of selling things to the high end, you know, I don't like to bore people. I think people's attention spans are very short. It's a very funny conversation. We used to be a high-end wholesale bank. And when I became CEO and I was going to go down, I was told that you could never work those two things together and that the brand could never service the low end and the high end. What I found is that's complete garbage, and that a brand, depending on how you position it, can service both the mass and the high end. And that what you have to do whenever you're selling a high-end thing is create an aspiration. You've got to make sure that your brand is aspirational. You're selling people dreams. You're selling people things that they think is different and they want to be associated with. And that's how you sell, you know, it's like selling someone overpriced bottled water. They still pay for it just because they believe it carries a certain thing. So it's a bit of a storyline you sell people.
Great. Next, there we go.
Hi, my name is Yemi, and I work in a Japanese company, actually, a subsidiary in the UK. I listened to the point you made, and there was one particular area that it sparked a question. You mentioned that, you know, if you are the CEO of a bank and you are taking depositors' money and you have equity, it makes sense to invest mostly in loans. And it said to me perhaps that perhaps banks would not be the institutions to offer patient capital to entrepreneurs. They would definitely be able to offer loans, but perhaps maybe they might not be the institutions to provide the patient equity that entrepreneurs would need. So the question I have for you is based partly on experience of the West, in the sense that I was looking at research by PwC, and it talked about the global allocation of funds to different regions. And certain countries in Africa are not considered emerging markets. They're considered frontier markets. And if that's the case, then if it's not going to come from foreign investment, where would you see the substantial amount of equity that's required to create large companies and medium-sized companies coming from, if it's not from loans and if it's not from foreign direct investment? Compared to the rest of the world, Africa is relatively poorer. Who will provide that?
Who will give you the capital? First of all, I couldn't agree with you more. Everybody blames banks, especially for not supporting SMEs. We're not there for the long term. We're not equity. We're not private equity firms. So I don't make any apologies for that. Where will the money come from? I think that's the whole point behind the theme of this conference, Made in Africa. I think we need to start looking inwards. I don't agree with you that Africa's poor. I think Africa's very rich. I think there's so much money in Africa, and most of Africa's money is in developed economies. And if more and more people invested that capital, the failure of the financial system largely in Africa is the lack of a proper private equity space. And that if more and more people decided to go into that, I'm going to advertise my job after this to you. My dream, actually, after I stop doing this, is to create a private equity firm for SMEs. And I'm confident that I will find enough capital inside Africa to start that fund. So I just think that more people need to start looking at private equity firms, and that there is enough money to grow private equity firms and give you the patient capital you need. Most people don't even know Africa. Most people call themselves Africa fund managers, have only ever been to South Africa. So,
I'm going to take one more question at the back there, but before I get to that, I'm going to ask you to follow up on this, which is your billionaire friends.
No, for customers, not friends. I don't have billionaire friends. They're a bit too high. Customers.
I'm just curious, what is holding back Africans with excess capital to invest from putting it back into businesses in the continent instead of into, sort of lovely properties in Mayfair?
Because they never made that money from businesses and sweating the capital, so they don't know how.
Fair enough. Question at the back.
Hello? Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Namdi. I work for a global investment bank here in London. You talked about the financial institutions helping the private sector and how they sort of interrelate. There is Eco-Atlantic, which is coming up in Lagos. The way in which London built Canary Wharf in the 90s, how do you think Eco-Atlantic is going to help the financial sector in Nigeria and in Africa at large?
God, gosh, I got to be careful because they're also my customers. I really don't think Eco-Atlantic is going to do much for the financial sector. And when I look, I'm a bit of a pragmatic person. I think when you look at Nigeria, there's so much land where you didn't need to create Eco-Atlantic, but some people like that. I think they did that in Dubai, but I don't expect there'll be any significant impact to the success of Eco-Atlantic, no. I think it'll just be another development like Banana Island.
I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask you the last question. And it's going to involve a little story that I'm going to tell you. And if you believe the story, then I'm definitely coming to get a big loan from your bank. And the story is that the organizers here are about to give you a little gift. And if you believe this here, Bill Gates just popped around last night and stuck $10 million into each of those little packets. And he said, you can do anything you like with it as long as you invest it, answerable to no one. So you pick, as long as you invest it in something that is going to promote, is going to make things in Africa. If you had $10 million, or should we make it 100? What is the kind of best idea that you've got that can say, the best investable idea for a made in Africa business?
God, easy. First, for the garment industry, a shared service facility, because everybody believes that it's finance. No, it's scale. Shared service facility that starts from having a training center to designing fabric, to producing the garments and creating a retail outlet. That would probably take half of it. The next half I'd put into a small food processing plant. So if you give me the 10 million, I'd be off and running.
There we go. Well, I'd like to ask all of you to thank Segun for some fascinating insights.
Thank you very much.